They say Mercedes isn't what it used to be, and honestly, they're right. Before the bean counters took over, before every decision ran through a cost-benefit analysis, Mercedes built cars with one philosophy: engineer it to outlive its owner. We're talking about an era when a 300,000-mile odometer wasn't a red flag, it was just getting broken in. Today, we're counting down 9 old Mercedes that were genuinely built to last forever. Number 9, Mercedes-Benz C-Class W202. Here's what shocked people most when they walked into a Mercedes dealership in 1993 to buy the entry-level model. It felt too good to be true, and you're about to see exactly why. The W202 wasn't just another small luxury sedan, it was Mercedes' response to critics who said they'd gone soft with the previous 190e. By the early 90s, buyers wanted safety, style, and something that didn't look like Cold War surplus. So Mercedes rolled up its sleeves and built a car that basically said, "Fine, we'll modernize, but we're not cutting corners." From 1993 to 2001, nearly 1.9 million W202s rolled off the production line. Compact, refined, and built during an era when Mercedes still treated quality control like a religion. That meant everything about this car was overbuilt. You could slam the doors 1,000 times and they'd still close with that trademark Mercedes thunk, a sound that honestly should be copyrighted. The buttons felt like they were carved from old Nokia phones. The dashboard looked borrowed from office equipment, but it was all business. No gimmicks. No fragile touchscreens, just rock-solid German logic. Under the hood lived some of the most bulletproof engines Mercedes ever produced. The M111 inline-4 was so over-engineered it could probably run on spite alone. Then came the M104 inline-6, smooth as silk and nearly as addictive. But if you were smart enough to pick the diesels, the OM605 or OM606, congratulations, you basically bought a car that refuses to die. Those engines weren't just reliable, they were geological events, unstoppable, unkillable, and perfectly happy running for 500,000 miles on basic maintenance. Of course, no legend is perfect. Rust loved the W202 like moths love wool sweaters. But even when the body started dissolving, the engines kept humming, the transmissions kept shifting, and the interiors refused to surrender. Number 8, Mercedes-Benz W114. Every great legend has an origin story, and for Mercedes reliability, the W114 is where it all began. Before the W123 became the poster child for German engineering, there was the W114, the car that wrote the blueprint for what built to last forever actually meant. Produced between 1968 and 1976, this was the great-grandmother of today's E-Class, and the reason your uncle still won't stop talking about how they don't make them like they used to. Mercedes didn't build the W114 to compete with other automakers, they built it to embarrass them. The result was a car over-engineered to the point of near insanity. The W114 introduced a diagonal swing rear axle that delivered the smoothest ride of its era, plus 4-wheel disc brakes, something American muscle cars with triple the horsepower didn't even bother with. It rode like a diplomat's limousine, handled like it was welded to the asphalt, and stopped like it could read your mind. But here's what cemented the W114's legacy. It introduced one of the most legendary diesel engines in automotive history, the OM617, a 5-cylinder turbocharged diesel that made around 80 horsepower. Not impressive on paper, absolutely unstoppable in reality. This engine became the stuff of legend among taxi drivers who racked up hundreds of thousands of miles without major repairs. Some W114s are still working as taxis in developing countries today, 5 decades after they were built. The interior was pure function over form, heavy switches that clicked with mechanical precision, seats that looked like they belonged in a German waiting room but somehow aged better than modern leather. Everything felt deliberate, engineered by people who understood that luxury isn't about flash, it's about longevity. And that philosophy, it became Mercedes' calling card for the next 2 decades. Number 7, Mercedes-Benz SL R129. Imagine a car so well built that even time itself seems afraid to mess with it. That's the Mercedes-Benz R129, the roadster that made reliability look sexy. When it debuted in 1989, the R129 wasn't just another convertible. It was a rolling engineering thesis on how to build the perfect Grand Tourer. Mercedes had spent over a decade developing it, because back then, the company's unspoken motto was, if it isn't overbuilt, it isn't leaving Stuttgart. Everything about this car was obsessive. The chassis was a fortress disguised as a luxury roadster. The soft top was fully automatic and hydraulically operated. No manual latches or fabric gymnastics required. Safety features included airbags, ABS, and stability control years before they became standard. And then there was the groundbreaking pop-up rollover bar that deployed in just 0.3 seconds if it detected a potential rollover. Beauty and brains, engineered during an era when Mercedes didn't cut costs, they cut steel. But the real heart of the R129's immortality was what lived under the hood. Mercedes offered an entire buffet of indestructible power plants. The 3.0-liter inline-6s were bomb-proof. The V8s, especially the M119 and M113, were masterpieces, refined, muscular, and capable of clocking hundreds of thousands of miles without complaint. The 5.0-liter V8 was a grunty, overbuilt masterpiece that might genuinely deserve the title of best engine Mercedes ever made. Mercedes' new engines alone wouldn't make the R129 immortal, so they equipped it with multi-link suspension, a stroke of genius, softly sprung for comfort but firmly damped for control. You could glide over a pothole at 80 miles per hour and feel like you were floating through butter. It was that rare balance of precision and poise that modern cars attempt and usually fail to replicate. Production ran from 1989 to 2001, 12 years, over 200,000 units sold, and today, well-maintained R129s still command respect on the road, looking far younger than their decades would suggest. Number 6. Mercedes-Benz S-Class W126. It's 1979. The world is dealing with an oil crisis and every automaker is scrambling, cutting weight, cutting power, cutting costs. Mercedes? They decided to cut none of that, just noise, vibration, and anything that didn't feel like pure class. The engineers were basically told, build a car so good that world leaders will prefer it over anything else. And they did, literally. The W126 became the unofficial transport for presidents, CEOs, and anyone who thought a private jet was too much effort. Mercedes didn't treat the W126 like a new model. They treated it like a scientific experiment in automotive longevity. Engineers obsessed over everything: aerodynamics, corrosion resistance, even door seals. They spent 7 years developing it before launch, which in automotive terms is like raising a child before introducing them to society. The result was a body so aerodynamic for its time that it sliced through air like a knife through butter, yet still looked dignified doing it. Then there's the mechanical side, the part that truly made the W126 immortal. The engines were the definition of forever. The M103 inline-6 and the legendary M117 and M119 V8s were smooth, understressed, and built to handle mileage numbers that would make modern cars weep. These weren't engines that screamed for attention. They just hummed along politely, no matter how hard you pushed them. Routine maintenance was their secret handshake. Treat them decently and they'd last decades. But what truly cemented the W126's legend wasn't just performance, it was protection. Mercedes pioneered safety innovations that made rival automakers take notes with tears in their eyes. Advanced crumple zones, ABS brakes, early airbag systems. It was the safest luxury car of its era and might still outperform some modern vehicles in a crash test. Number 5. Mercedes-Benz C-Class W204. If the early 2000s taught Mercedes anything, it's that you can't live off your reputation forever. The W203 C-Class had become a universally despised Mercedes. Rust issues, electrical gremlins, and a general feeling that the Germans were cutting corners to save a few euros. Customer complaints piled up, brand loyalty started cracking. So when it came time to develop the W204, Mercedes engineers basically said, alright, enough, time to remind the world why we're Mercedes-Benz. And they did it the old-fashioned way, by over-engineering everything. While rivals were debating how light they could make their cars, Mercedes went the opposite direction. Make it heavy, make it safe, make it survive a head-on collision with time itself. The result was a body constructed from 70% high-strength steel and a chassis so solid that even sports cars felt inadequate by comparison. Safety became a selling point again, with 7 airbag standard and optional extras for those who wanted to survive literally anything. But Mercedes didn't stop there. The suspension setup was mind-blowing. A 3-link front suspension with twin lower arms, hardware usually reserved for high-end sports sedans. Most manufacturers would have chosen the cheaper option. Mercedes chose what felt right. Higher trims got the Agility Control adaptive dampers, a luxury hand-me-down from the S-Class. Technology that made zero financial sense, but transformed the W204 into a baby S-Class that glided over imperfect roads like they didn't exist. Step inside, and it felt like Mercedes had written an apology letter to everyone who complained about the previous generation. Gone were the flimsy plastics and sad trim pieces. Everything felt engineered to outlive you. Even the wiring harnesses were reinforced, as if the engineers were on a personal mission to erase every bad memory the W203 left behind. But what really cemented the W204's reputation was what sat under the hood. Mercedes installed engines that refused to die even decades later. The M271 and M272 engines, both smooth and robust, proved that Mercedes could still build bulletproof power plants in a world obsessed with downsizing. For the diesel crowd, the OM646 and OM651 engines were so tough they outlived entire taxi fleets and probably a few mechanics' careers. Production ran from 2007 to 2014. It wasn't just a return to form, it was a statement. Mercedes was back. Number 4, Mercedes-Benz E-Class W123. If Mercedes ever had a "we peaked here" moment, it was the W123 E-Class. This wasn't just a car, it was Mercedes-Benz looking at the rest of the automotive world and saying, "Watch this." They didn't design it to last a decade, they built it to survive empires. But what made it so indestructible? Let's start with the heart of the beast, the OM617 diesel engine. It made around 80 horsepower, which meant 0 to 60 in roughly sometime next week. But here's the thing, it always got there. Slowly, faithfully, and with the patience of a monk who's taken a vow of silence. These engines were so tough that in the 1980s, humanitarian organizations used W123s in conflict zones because they knew one thing: the roads might fall apart, but the car wouldn't. The OM617 could run on cooking oil in a pinch, tolerate neglect that would kill modern engines, and still fire up on the first turn of the key decades later. There's a W123 300D in Morocco with over 2.9 million miles on the original engine. Not rebuilt, original. Still running taxi routes. That's not an exception. It's typical W123 behavior. The magic wasn't just under the hood either. Everything about the W123 felt like it was engineered by people who hated failure. The paint was thick enough to survive decades of sun exposure without fading. The switches clicked like precision instruments. Even the seats, which looked like something from a German waiting room, aged better than most luxury leather does today. But here's where the W123 truly shines: simplicity. No fragile electronics, no innovations that became liabilities 5 years later. You could fix almost anything on this car with a basic toolset and a free afternoon. No specialized software required, no proprietary diagnostic equipment, just mechanical logic that made sense. That's why decades later, it's the darling of DIY mechanics and classic taxi drivers alike. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, W123s are still the preferred taxi because mechanics know them inside and out, parts are still available, and the cars simply refuse to quit. Mercedes built the W123 from 1976 to 1985, nearly 2.7 million units sold worldwide. It became the best-selling Mercedes of its time, and for good reason. It represented everything the brand stood for: quality, durability, and engineering excellence without compromise. Number 3, Mercedes-Benz S-Class W140. It's the late 1980s. Mercedes has just wrapped up the W126 S-Class, a global hit. Any normal company would pop champagne, slap on a new grille, and call it a day. But Mercedes engineers, no. They looked at perfection and said, let's ruin our finances to make something even better. That's how the W140 was born. Not from logic, but from obsession. Development costs exceeded $1 billion. And keep in mind, this was before people casually threw around billion in everyday conversation. It was pure engineering madness. Mercedes engineers spent 6 years and over $1 billion developing it. Every panel gap was measured by hand. Every hinge, gasket, and bolt was tested like it was going to space. Even the wiring insulation was redesigned because, according to Mercedes, plastic fatigue was something worth losing sleep over. The windshield wipers had 2 motors because apparently one wasn't good enough. The side mirrors automatically folded at high speeds to reduce wind noise. And if you couldn't park a car this massive, no problem. It came with tiny hydraulic antennas that popped up from the trunk to mark the corners. Because who needs sensors when you can have literal metal feelers? Everything about the W140 screamed, we can't help ourselves. The doors were so heavy that Mercedes had to install a vacuum-assisted closing system because otherwise half their customers would have dislocated shoulders trying to shut them. The rear view mirrors automatically folded to reduce wind noise, not because anyone complained, but because someone in Stuttgart had insomnia over aerodynamic efficiency. Pop the hood and Mercedes' madness only deepened. The S-Class offered everything from tank-grade straight sixes to a 6.0-liter V12 delivering 394 horsepower, perfectly disguised behind the calmest idle you'd ever hear. But here's what made the W140 legendary beyond the excess. It worked, all of it. The complexity didn't translate to fragility. These cars ran for hundreds of thousands of miles with proper maintenance, proving that over-engineering, when done correctly, creates reliability rather than destroying it. Production ran from 1991 to 1998. It was criticized at launch for being too big, too expensive, too excessive. Number 2, Mercedes-Benz E-Class, W124. Imagine you're an engineer at Mercedes in the mid-80s. Management walks in and says, "We need a new E-Class." And instead of asking for deadlines or budgets, you just ask one question: how indestructible do you want it? And Mercedes says, yes. That's how the W124 was born. Built from 1984 to 1997, it wasn't just an E-Class, it defined the E-Class. The kind of car that reminds us engineering used to be an art form, not a spreadsheet exercise. The W124 was built during the golden age of Daimler-Benz, before cost-cutting became a corporate buzzword and before Chrysler ever got involved. This was the era when engineers spent months debating questions like, what's the perfect resistance for a glove box latch? Or, can we make the turn signal stalk feel more satisfying than an espresso machine lever? It was engineering insanity, and that's why the W124 still feels unshakably solid today. Renowned Italian automotive designer Bruno Sacco gave it that boxy stance softened by rounded edges, so it looked powerful but never brutish. That's why, parked next to today's plastic-heavy luxury cars, the W124 still carries itself with quiet confidence. Despite being overbuilt with thick, durable steel, it was surprisingly practical. Mechanics loved it because you could disassemble 70% of the car using just 3 socket sizes: 10mm, 13mm, and 17mm. Mercedes designed it not just to last forever, but to make sure you could help it last forever. There's a documented case of a 1991 W124 that cruised past 2 million miles with just routine oil and filter changes. Not a fluke, just proper engineering meeting proper maintenance. But what truly made the W124 legendary wasn't just how it was built, it was what lived under the hood. Mercedes offered everything from economical 4 cylinders to the smoothest silk inline 6s. And then of course, there were the diesels. The legendary OM603 and OM606 engines became famous for running 500,000 miles with basic maintenance. They ran on low quality diesel without complaint. They tolerated extended oil change intervals. They started in freezing temperatures and scorching heat with equal reliability. The W124 also introduced innovations that became industry standards. The first Mercedes with a driver's side airbag as standard equipment, multi-link rear suspension for improved handling, and aerodynamics that were genuinely impressive for a brick-shaped sedan. Production numbers tell the story. Over 2.7 million 124s were built across all body styles: sedans, wagons, coupes, and convertibles. Number 1. Mercedes-Benz G-Class W463. Most luxury SUVs are built for mall parking lots and school drop-offs. The Mercedes G-Class was built for war. Literally. The G-Wagen started life in 1979 as a military vehicle developed jointly with Steyr Daimler Puch for the Austrian and German armies. The brief was simple: create an unstoppable off-road vehicle that could survive anything from desert heat to Arctic cold, from muddy trenches to rocky mountain passes. Make it simple enough for field repairs, tough enough for combat zones, and reliable enough to stake lives on. Mercedes delivered all of that and then kept building it for the next 4 decades. The W463, introduced in 1990, represented the evolution of that original military design into something civilians could actually buy. But make no mistake, underneath the leather and luxury options, it remained fundamentally a military-grade machine. The body-on-frame construction was built like a tank. 3 fully locking differentials, front, center, and rear, gave it off-road capability that embarrassed dedicated rock crawlers. The suspension featured rigid axles front and rear, old-school technology that modern SUVs abandoned for comfort but the G-Class kept for indestructibility. Under the hood, Mercedes offered engines that matched the G-Class's immortal chassis. The OM606 turbo diesel, a legend in its own right, could run forever on minimal maintenance. Later models got the M113 V8, smooth and powerful enough for highway cruising, but understressed enough to handle the abuse of serious off-roading. But here's what separated the G-Class from every other luxury SUV. It actually worked. While Range Rovers were becoming unreliable fashion accessories and Land Cruisers got softer with each generation, the G-Class remained brutally honest. It didn't pretend to be comfortable, the ride was harsh, the handling was vague, and the aerodynamics were worse than a brick. But it went anywhere, survived everything, and never apologized for what it was. The civilian market caught on slowly. Early G-Classes were expensive, crude, and impractical for daily use, but their reputation for indestructibility built a cult following. Today, classic W463s from the 1990s and early 2000s command premium prices, especially diesels with manual transmissions.